Good evening, respected chairpersons and my dear students. The topic of today's discussion is pregnancy with hypertensive disorders. Hypertensive disorder in the pregnancy is a very important division of obstetric anesthesia, as it is a major cause of maternal morbidity and mortality, and in daily basis, we as anesthesiologists encounter these patients daily. Hypertension in pregnancy is the most common medical disorder of pregnancy, and it affects around 6 to 10% of pregnancies. It is a leading cause of maternal mortality and morbidity, and also it poses an important risk factor for fetal complications. We will be discussing our topic with a case scenario and the topic in itself in detail later on. Now, a patient of 24-year-old age, primi gravida, comes to the OPD with cessation of menses of 8 months and all the signs and symptoms of pregnancy with swelling over the feet for few days. Patient gives history of headache and swelling all over the body for past 1 week, which was progressive and was associated with excessive weight gain. In the first trimester and second trimester, patient did not attend any of the ANC clinics, and in the third trimester also, patient did not visited any of the ANC clinic. In the past history, there was no history that was suggestive of any systemic disease, and on examination the patient had the general condition which was very poor, and pallor was present as well as the pedal edema was present. We shall be focusing on the positive findings. So on the systemic examination, the per-abdominal examination was within normal limit, as well as the respiratory and cardiovascular system examination was also within normal limit. Patient was conscious, oriented, obeyed verbal command, and with GCS of 15 or 15. On the vitals, patient had a pulse rate of 90 per minute. The blood pressure was 160 by 90 millimeter of mercury with a respiratory rate of 18 per minute, which was regular. And on investigation, we had a hemogram done, which showed the hemoglobin of 8 gram percent with TLC of 10,900. The platelet counts were 92,000 per millimeter cube. And in the kidney functions, the patient had a serum creatinine of 1 milligram percent and uric acid of 5.7 milligram per deciliter. The LFT showed the proteins of 3.8 gram percent and an AG ratio of 0.8. The urine examination showed the albumin was 3 plus and urinary protein were 0.3 gram per day. Now, what can be the differential diagnosis? As you know that the hypertensive disorders encompasses the range of conditions like chronic hypertension, gestational hypertension, preeclampsia superimposed on chronic hypertension and eclampsia. So though it's very difficult to diagnose because the clinical presentation is often similar despite the complex differences in their underlying pathophysiologies and prognosis. So in our patient, we have these differential diagnosis. We have to rule out. Now coming on to the positive findings in our patient had headache, swelling all over the feet, weight gain, pedal edema, and pallor. The lab findings which were positive were serum protein was 3.8 gram percent, AG ratio of 0.8, albumin was 3 plus, and urine protein was 0.3 gram. The serum uric acid level was 5.7 milligram per deciliter. Though our patient did not have any history of dyspnea, chest pain, palpitation, and yellow discoloration of eyes and so on. Now, the gestational hypertension. First comes the gestational hypertension. As the patient showed in the OPD, on 32 weeks of gestation, the blood pressure was 160/90, proteinuria was there, edema was there. So the gestational hypertension is kind of ruled out because the gestational hypertension appears after the 20 weeks of gestation, though it appears after 20 weeks of gestation or during the first 24 hours postpartum, but it is without proteinuria and it resolves by 12 weeks of postpartum. Though these patients have a high risk of hypertension in the future pregnancies also. Now coming on to the chronic hypertension, our patient had no previous history of hypertension or any treatment. There was no family history. And the hypertension was noted for the first time after 20 weeks of gestation. Hence, the chronic hypertension is also ruled out. In the chronic hypertension is defined as the blood pressure of more than 140/90 antedates pregnancy, and or it develops before the 20th week of gestation, which is not attributed to the gestational trophoblastic disease, or the hypertension which was first diagnosed after 20 weeks of gestation and persistent even after 12 weeks postpartum. Now, preeclampsia is the likely cause because the blood pressure is high. There is edema, headache, there is proteinuria, the history of weight gain is there, and the onset of hypertension was more than 20 weeks of gestation. The eclampsia is ruled out because patient does not have any history or any episode of seizure disorders, but the patient can land up in this emergency anytime if the appropriate measures are not taken, because we have to be very cautious because these patients are on a very high risk of getting eclampsia later on. Preeclampsia superimposed on chronic hypertension is not there because there is no history of hypertension, no family history, proteinuria does not antedate pregnancy, and there is no history suggestive of chronic hypertension. The superimposed preeclampsia on chronic hypertension is said when there is new onset of proteinuria in hypertensive women, but no proteinuria before 20 weeks of gestation. And or there is sudden increase in proteinuria or blood pressure or platelet counts less than 1 lakh millimeter cube in a woman with hypertension and proteinuria before 20 weeks of gestation. Now comes to the main topic, the preeclampsia. What is preeclampsia? Preeclampsia is defined as the new onset of hypertension and proteinuria after 20 weeks of gestation, and the diagnosis of preeclampsia in the absence of proteinuria when any of the signs and symptoms of end organ involvement are present. Like the etiology is still unknown, and the preeclampsia is a unique disorder which is unique to human pregnancy. The onset of systemic hypertension with proteinuria or any of the severe feature of preeclampsia is sufficient to diagnose a patient as having preeclampsia. The disease requires the presence of trophoblast, not a fetus. So these disease can occur before the 20th week in presence of the trophoblastic tissue. These disorders complicate 10% of the pregnancy, and preeclampsia being the 5% of pregnant women. Eclampsia occurs in about 1:2,000 pregnancy, and the incidence is very high in the developing countries like our country. Diagnostic criteria for preeclampsia: there should be pregnancy of more than 20 weeks. There should be a hypertension of more than 140/90, or at least it should be at least twice apart, 6 hours apart. And the systolic or diastolic blood pressure, which is more than 30 on 15 millimeter of mercury above the baseline values, or the mean arterial pressure more than 105 millimeter of mercury or more than 20 millimeter of mercury above the baseline values. The weight gain is the first sign of impending preeclampsia. However, the proteinuria is not essential for the diagnosis because it appears very late, and the edema is not a reliable sign because it occurs in many other conditions in the pregnancy. Now, what is preeclampsia? As we know that there is hypertension, proteinuria, and edema. In the severe preeclampsia, there are the signs and symptoms of end organ disease. The blood pressure is very high, that is more than 160/110. There is renal insufficiency, proteinuria, which is more than 5 grams per 24 hours, or 3 plus or 4 plus on dipstick, oliguria less than 500 ml per 24 hours. There are new onset of cerebral and visual disturbances, and there is pulmonary edema or cyanosis. Patient may complain of epigastric or right upper quadrant pain. That means the liver is involved and there are impaired liver functions. There is thrombocytopenia, or there is evidence of any evidence of fetal compromise like placental abruption and all. What are the risk factors for preeclampsia? There are many risk factors which may be because of the maternal condition and which are specific to maternal factors. pregnancy associated and exogenous factors. In the maternal conditions, there is, if the patient is having chronic hypertension, patient is having chronic renal disease, or the patient has any microvascular disease like diabetes and obesity, these patients are at a very high risk of preeclampsia. Age at the time of age at the time of conceiving, that is advanced maternal age. If the time interval between the pregnancies is very less, then there is high incidence of preeclampsia. Family history of hypertension during pregnancy. What are the pregnancy related factors? That are multiple pregnancy, if the patient, the fetus has any congenital anomaly, polyhydramnios, there is increased trophoblastic mass like H mole is there, and in the exogenous factors, if the patient is having a high stressful job is patient is doing, then the risk is very high. There are other risk factors also which are of importance, like angiotensin gene T20, the presence of angiotensin gene T235, family or personal history of preeclampsia, proteinase deficiency, and so on. Now, what is the pathophysiology? The pathophysiology of this is very complex, and the exact pathophysiology is still not known. The exact pathogenic mechanism responsible for the initiation and progression of preeclampsia are not known. It is said to be a two-stage disorder. The asymptomatic first stage occurs early in the pregnancy with impaired remodeling of spiral arteries. The end branches of the uterine artery that supply the placenta. What happens in the normal pregnancy? The embryo-derived cytotrophoblasts, they invade the decidual and myometrial segment of the spiral arteries. They replace endothelium and cause remodeling of the vascular smooth muscles in the inner elastic lumina. What the luminal diameter of the spiral arteries, it increases up to 4 times, and it results in the creation of flaccid tubes that which provides the low resistant and vascular pathway to the intervillous space. Furthermore, what happens? The remodeled arteries are there unresponsive to vasoactive stimuli. So these alteration in the maternal vasculature, it ensures the adequate blood flow to nourish the growing fetus and placenta. And what happens in these preeclamptic patients? The cytotrophoblast, which invades the uterine myometrium, is incomplete, and only the decidual segments undergo the change. The myometrial spiral arteries are not invaded, and they are not remodeled, and thus remains small and constricted. And they are also hyporesponsive to vasomotor stimuli. So the failure of normal angiogenesis, it results in the superficial presentation. The abnormal placentation which occurs, it results in the decreased placental perfusion and placental infarcts, which predisposes the fetus to the growth restriction. The placental ischemia worsens throughout the pregnancy. And what happens? The narrowed vessels, they are increasingly unable to meet the needs of the growing fetoplacental unit, thus causes the intrauterine growth retardation. In some women, the reduced perfusion of the intervillous space in the first stage, it leads to the symptomatic second stage, which is characterized by the release of anti-angiogenic factors from the intervillous space into the maternal circulation. These factors, they cause widespread maternal endothelial dysfunction and an accentuated systemic inflammatory response. In the absence of preeclampsia, like the patient is not having any preeclampsia, the healthy endometrium prevents platelet activation and activates circulating anticoagulants and buffers the response to pressors, maintains the fluid in the intravascular compartment. Okay, these normal functions, they are disrupted in preeclampsia. As a result, what happens? The pregnant woman develops hypertension and proteinuria. As you can see here in the placenta, when there is abnormal placentation, the changes in the endothelium and blood is there. the vascular tone is increased, permeability is increased, and there is increase in the fibrin deposition. In blood, the platelets, the prostacyclins and antithrombin third levels decrease, and there is release of thromboxane A2, vasoconstrictors, procoagulants. They all ultimately lead to the DIC and the hemolysis. Now, the endothelial damage, what it causes the HELLP syndrome, as there is decreased production and sensitivity to vasodilators, and there is increased sensitivity to vasoconstrictor. There is increase in systemic vascular resistance, as well as the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, it gets activated, and which leads to the sodium and water retention, leading to hypertension and edema. And then because there is increase in glomerular capillary permeability and proteinuria, it leads to edema and preeclampsia and eclampsia state. Now, to the systems, what these pathophysiologic changes do. The hypertension, it's in the early sign, and the response to the catecholamines is exaggerated. And there is increased sensitivity to angiotensin 2. The consistency between the cardiac output, mean arterial pressure, and systemic vascular resistance is lost, and the plasma volume is reduced in considerable severity. The oncotic pressure is reduced. And despite there are normal filling pressure, the intravascular volume is reduced. That is to the 30%. These variation in presentation depends on the prior treatment and severity and duration of the disease. The total body water is increased because there is generalized edema, and depending on the severity, there are variations from high cardiac output state to low systemic vascular resistance to low cardiac output state and high SVR. These patients are prone to develop pulmonary edema because there is reduced colloid osmotic pressure, which falls further postpartum. And there is, of course, there is a high permeability of capillaries. In the airway, as there is sodium and water retention, and there is decreased colloid osmotic pressure, there are leaky capillaries, they all lead to edema of the airway. There is laryngeal and facial edema, there is distortion of glottis, there is subglottic edema. So you have to be very, very careful about the encountering a difficult airway in these patients. As we know that the airway is already difficult in pregnant patient, but the difficulty increases in preeclamptic patients very much. The mucosa is friable and there are increased chances of trauma. Now, in the kidneys, you can see that renal blood flow and GFR, they decrease, and renal failure occurs due to low plasma volume or renal artery vasospasm. There is proteinuria because there is endothelial damage in the glomerulus. They become leaky, there are swelling with subendothelial protein deposition. These functions, though they recover very quickly in the postpartum period, but postpartum oliguria parallels the severity of preeclampsia. In the liver, epigastric pain is the ominous sign because it is due to the liver swelling, the periportal hemorrhage, and there are chances of subcapsular hematoma, which may cause hepatic rupture. The patient increasing the mortality to approximately 30%, and it warrants imaging, and especially when there is liver enzymes are increased. HELLP syndrome occurs in the 20% of severe preeclamptic patients. In the coagulation system, you can see that generally it's a hypercoagulable state with the evidence of platelet activation. The platelets are activated and there is increased fibrinolysis. Thrombocytopenia is common in this condition, but less than 10% patient have a platelet count of less than 1 lakhs. The DIC, it occurs in these patients, 7% incidence is there, and there is, especially with the patient who have placental abruption, intrauterine death or postpartum hemorrhage. In the CNS also, the symptoms are there. If the eclampsia is severe, patient may complain of headache, visual disturbances, seizures, hyperreflexia is usually present. The eclamptic seizures may occur even without the high BP because the cause is not the high blood pressure. The cause is basically the cerebral edema, thrombosis, vasospasm, and hypertensive encephalopathy. In the eyes also, there is a spasm of the arterial muscles. There is arterial spasm, there is retinal edema, there can be detachment, and patient may complain of scotoma or blindness. In the this condition has a many maternal complications. A list of complications are there, like hypertension, you can see congestive heart failure, pulmonary edema, laryngeal edema, cerebral hemorrhage, hypovolemia, epigastric pain. We have discussed these complications before also. In the fetal complications, there is prematurity because of the abnormal presentation, as we have already discussed. And the intrauterine growth retardation is there. Small for gestational age babies are there, intracranial hemorrhage. The leading cause of intrauterine morbidity and mortality is uteroplacental insufficiency, which is caused by placental infarcts followed by placental abrasion and chorioamnionitis. We have already discussed this in pathophysiology section. Now comes the management, which is very important and which is very difficult also. As far as the medical management is concerned, one has to stabilize and deliver the baby. The medical management, when the obstetrician is awaiting for delivery, if the pregnancy is less than 34 weeks and there is no imminent not imminent, and there is no indication of expedited delivery, then use the steroid for 48 hours for fetal lung maturity. Maintain the diastolic blood pressure between 105 to 110. Start antihypertensives, and for seizure prophylaxis, start magnesium sulfate. Always monitor fluid balance. Input-output charting should be done. The symptoms, reflexes, platelets, LFTs, and proteinuria should be watched on a regular basis. Now, the delivery of the fetus and placenta is the definitive treatment. Now, what should be the goals of the treatment? Despite the besides the general management of the patient, one has to focus on the control of hypertension, correction of intravascular fluid volume, maintenance of urine output, prevent seizures, and manage and prevent maternal and fetal complications as far as possible. What is the medical management of hypertension in this patient? The drug of choice is labetalol. What is your goal? The goal is to maintain the blood pressure, systolic blood pressure between 170 to 130 and diastolic blood pressure between 90 to 110. Always avoid precipitous fall in blood pressure and give judicious IV fluid for volume expansion. The drug of choice for as antihypertensive therapy is labetalol, because it has a faster onset and it is relatively free of maternal side effects. It is a combined alpha as well as beta blocker, and the alpha and beta blocking activity is 1:7. It blocks the effect on the uteroplacental vasculature. The dosage is 10 to 20 milligrams slow IV, and it can be repeated according to the response, and always use this drug in the asthmatic and congestive heart failure. Next comes the hydralazine. It is also a very good antihypertensive. It also has a rapid onset and short duration and direct effect. But the disadvantages are that it causes maternal tachycardia, which is not there in the labetalol. You can use nitroglycerin and sodium nitroprusside also as an anesthesiologist, but you have to plan for intra-arterial monitoring before starting these drugs, because in the nitroglycerin, there is a risk of excessive hypertension and it causes the decrease in the uteroplacental blood flow. High dose of anti-G may cause methemoglobinemia. In the sodium nitroprusside, there is a risk of cyanide toxicity and it should always be given on a short-term basis. For the chronic rise in blood pressure, methyl dopa is most commonly used agent. However, we can use labetalol, hydrazine, and clonidine also. The beta blockers have a risk of fetal bradycardia, and the calcium channel blockers have the risk of magnesium sulfate toxicity. It potentiate the magnesium sulfate toxicity. The ACE inhibitors, they are not recommended because of their teratogenic potential. The angiotensin 2 antagonists have the high fetal risk. The beta blockers like atenolol, they can cause fetal maldevelopment, and diuretics are not advised and they are not preferred also. Next comes the volume management. The correction of intravascular volume, always do it before you start for antihypertensives, because these patients are volume depleted. They have contracted peripheral circulation. When you can consider starting with the crystalloid solution in a dose of 1 to 2 ml per kilogram per hour, with adjustments based on the patient's clinical condition and urine output. The CVP measurement and pulmonary arterial catheter, they are the option is there, but they should be used when there is a urgent and important need. The colloid solution, although they are set to improve the colloid osmotic pressure, but they have a relative limited role. They are controversial to use, and there is risk of increased CVP and pedal edema, and also studies have shown that there is no improvement in the outcome also while using colloid solutions. We can use the half DNS, like in the dose of 7 to 10 ml per hour. They are well tolerated, but avoid the rapid infusion of dextrose containing solutions, because they cause maternal hyperglycemia and neonatal hyperglycemia with hyperbilirubinemia in the neonate. Avoid dextrose in water because of its antidiuretic effects, and transfuse blood when the hematocrit is less than 27%. Blood component are indicated when the platelets are low, and FFP is can be given when there is a need. Now, the treatment of oliguria, the normal urate output is to be maintained. And if there is persistent oliguria, you can give a fluid challenge of 500 ml of crystalloids. If there is no effect, then you can consider the low dose dopamine infusion, but avoid repetitive unmonitored fluid administration. You can consider CVP monitoring if there is no coagulation disorder is present. And you have to assess the risk and the benefits of putting a CVP monitor in these patients. Now, coming on to the seizure prophylaxis. Seizure prophylaxis is very important, and the magnesium sulfate is the drug of choice for seizure treatment if the patient has eclampsia, and for seizure prophylaxis in the preeclamptic patient. The doses are the loading dose of 4 gram 20% solution over 5 minutes, which is followed by the continuous infusion of 1 to 2 gram per hour. The magnesium sulfate, it has both the central and peripheral effects. It blocks the calcium influx and it reverses the cerebral vasoconstriction. It causes the presynaptic release, decreases the presynaptic release of acetylcholine and the post-junction receptor activity to the acetylcholine. It has a mild relaxant effect on vascular as well as uterine smooth muscles. It has an important effect on fibrin deposition. It decreases it, and it increases the hepatic and renal circulation. But it is also not free of its adverse effect. The toxicity from overdoses causes respiratory and cardiac problems. It increases bleeding. There is hypotension with hemorrhage, and there is decrease in the uterine contractility. One has to be aware of these side effects. The drug is renally excreted, and the preeclamptics are prone to renal failure. Hence, you have to closely monitor the magnesium sulfate levels, either clinically by patellar reflexes or check their serum levels 6 to 8 hours of duration. And the therapeutic level are the 4 to 7 milliequivalent per liter, while the patellar reflexes are lost at 8 to 10. There is respiratory depression if the serum levels are 10 to 15. You have to watch for respiratory paralysis, and if the levels exceed 25 to 30 milliequivalent per liter, there can be a cardiac arrest. The treatment of magnesium toxicity: stop the drug, start IV calcium gluconate, and manage the airway. Now, what are the indications of expedited delivery? The indication is the fetal distress, and if the hypertension is getting out of control, there is worsening of end organ dysfunction, there is worsening or development of HELLP syndrome, or the patient has seizures. Now comes the role of anesthesiologist in the management of preeclampsia. Why you are important? Because you are familiar with the drugs that makes us potentially key figures in the multidisciplinary management of these patients. We have to provide the anesthesia and analgesia for operative and non-operative delivery of these patients, and provide a particular clinical challenge requiring considerable skill and experience in the part of as an anesthetist. What is the role? Role is you have to provide the pain relief, manage respiratory and cardiovascular functions, control the fluid balance, prevent and manage the life-threatening complications which can arise from this condition. Now, the patient comes to you and you have to evaluate this patient. First of all, you have to evaluate about the clinical, do the clinical proper clinical examination, take history if available, and do the pre-anesthetic evaluation. Look for aspiration prophylaxis. Particular attention should be paid for the airway assessment. Assess the airway. Look for facial edema or stridor, which can indicate airway edema, and thus may land you in a situation of difficult intubation. There is also a risk of pulmonary edema, and so the hydration should be judicious. Now for the operative or non-operative delivery, you may consider regional block and as well as general anesthesia. You have two choices. Now, what are the concerns for the regional block? Because there is possibility of severe secondary fall of blood pressure in the patient of volume contraction. There is risk of pulmonary edema due to excessive fluid. And there is also a risk of use of pressor agent to treat the hypotension caused by your regional block. So you have to look for these points. Now in the monitoring part, the central monitoring, invasive central monitoring and invasive intra-arterial blood pressure monitoring, it is indicated if the patient has pulmonary edema or oliguria, which is unresponsive to fluid challenge, but you have to look for coagulation profile first before putting the central line in this patient, as it can cause very it has very high chances of bleeding intrathoracically. In the intra-arterial blood pressure monitoring, it is indicated if the patient has refractory hypertension and if you are planning of an antihypertensive infusion like nitroglycerin or sodium nitroprusside. Now, for the lab assessment, always get a complete blood count, and an elevated hemocrit, it suggests that the patient is having hypovolemia, thrombocytopenia. It occurs in 15% of these patients. A platelet count of less than 70,000, it indicates that there is risk of epidural edema. So you have to consider, you have to assess the risk of epidural edema, epidural hematoma. And a test of platelet function can be done in evaluating the patients eligible for regional anesthesia if the patient count is in the range of 70,000 to 1 lakh. Get the liver function test done. Go for blood urea nitrogen and creatinine, as they are essential. They determine the severity of preeclampsia or they identify the presence of HELLP syndrome. Get an ABG done. A baseline ABG should be done. So it will help you later on, and a chest radiograph if at all is required. Now, what are the benefits of regional blocks in these patients of preeclampsia? Because the regional block, it provides a superior pain relief over the parenteral narcotics. Their hemodynamic effects are beneficial. They cause reduction in the blood pressure with a small reduction in systemic vascular resistance. The epidural analgesia is said to reduce the SD flow ratio in the uterine artery by 25%. And there is decrease in the vascular resistance and there is relief in the vasospasm. It increases the intravenous blood flow in the 77% in severe preeclampsia without decreasing the metal blood pressure or fetal heart rate abnormalities. It is it has one of the most important advantages because you can provide the labor epidural analgesia, and if required, you can rapidly initiate the anesthesia for emergency LSCS. Epidural anesthesia is preferred by many anesthesiologists in the severe preeclamptic patient in a non-urgent setting. For urgent cases, you can use spinal anesthesia. Now, these are the benefits of epidural anesthesia, as we have already discussed. The pain relief is very good. They attenuate the hypertensive response to pain. They reduce the circulating catecholamines. They improve the intravenous blood flow. It causes stable cardiac output as compared to spinal block. So it can be given as a labor analgesia with bupivacaine. You can choose in the concentration of 0.25%, and 0.5 to 0.75 can be used for epidural anesthesia. Now comes the spinal anesthesia. It can be used in the severe preeclampsia cases also, and you can use bupivacaine for these cases. You can add opioids to bupivacaine. What are the advantages of the spinal anesthesia over general anesthesia or epidural anesthesia? Is that you can there is elimination of the risk of severe hypertensive response to the laryngoscopy and intubation. It's a more reliable anesthesia and than the epidural technique. The small size of the needle is required as compared to epidural, so there are less chances of epidural hematoma. The level which is required is T4 sensory levels, and in most cases you can give 12 to 15% of bupivacaine, which is adequate to achieve the desired T4 sensory levels. Should the blood pressure decreases because of this block to more than 30%, you can give you should provide the left uterine displacement and increase the rate of fluid infusion combined with either ephedrine 5 milligram IV in incremental doses, or phenylephrine you can use if you have in your setting 100 milligram 100 microgram intravenously. Now, what are the precautions you should take while you are choosing the renal blocks? Prior to placing the renal block in the preeclampsia, it is recommended that you check for the platelet count. But there is no concrete evidence that how much platelet count should be the safe platelet count for putting the renal anesthesia in a preeclampsia patient. Any clinical evidence of DIC? If there is any clinical evidence of DIC, then you should not give renal block. In the absence of such signs, if the platelet count is more than 1 lakh, the renal blocks can be counted as safe. Bleeding time is now has been discredited as it is as an indicator of epidural bleeding risk, and it is not indicated nowadays. If the obstetrician is giving low dose aspirin, it is also not a contraindication to renal anesthesia in a preeclampsia. Now coming on to the general anesthesia. General anesthesia, the indications are when patient is undergoing cesarean section and who refuse regional anesthesia, or they have the disordered coagulopathy. The general anesthesia is selected when there is hemorrhage, patient is having antepartum hemorrhage or sepsis, is there for the emergency cesarean section. If there is fetal distress, always monitor the fetal heart rate. Either you are placing the block or you are preparing the patient for induction of general anesthesia. Before induction of anesthesia, it is always essential to restore the intravascular fluid volume and control the blood pressure, as we have done in the renal block techniques also. In the induction of anesthesia is usually done using propofol, etomidate, thiopentone or propofol, plus succinylcholine to facilitate tracheal intubation. Some anesthesiology, they use the defasciculating dose of NDMR, which is not required if the magnesium therapy is already given to the patient, because it attenuates the fasciculation produced by the succinylcholine. Consider the use of small size endotracheal tube, because there is a risk of airway edema and you may cause trauma if you use a larger size of endotracheal tube. The blood pressure responses to the direct laryngoscopy and intubation are likely to be exaggerated in these patients, and there is increased risk of cerebral hemorrhage and pulmonary edema. So what you should do, you should always go for short duration laryngoscopy, and it is the most predictable method for minimizing the magnitude as well as the duration of blood pressure and heart rate responses which are evoked by tracheal intubation. So always reduce your intubation, laryngoscopy and intubation time to 15 seconds. And you can also use the drugs like hydralazine you can use in the dose of 5 to 10 milligram intravenously. 10 to, you should start it 10 to 15 minutes before, or labetalol, which can also be started 5 to 10 minutes before you induce the anesthesia. They people consider nitroglycerin also, but in our setup we use labetalol or hydralazine. If anybody has it, you can use it. And low doses of volatile anesthetic should be given in the dose of 0.5 to 1 mg with or without 50% of nitrous oxide. In these patients, the major determinant of neonatal depression is the prolonged interval between the uterine incision and delivery of the baby. So the duration of anesthesia being the important only for the prolonged duration of administration prior to delivery. After delivery, the anesthesia is typically supplemented with opioids. The potentiation of muscle relaxation by magnesium may occur, and thus we need a peripheral nerve stimulator. If you have in your setup, then use it because it is essential for monitoring the neuromuscular function. Now coming on to the hazards of general anesthesia, because as you know that the airway edema is common, always re-examine the airway. Edema may appear or worsen at that time during the course of the disease. The edema may be there in the tongue, face, as well as the laryngeal edema can be there. The laryngoscopy and intubation may cause severe rise in blood pressure. Use drugs, labetalol, anti-G, esmolol can be used, or use lidocaine, fentanyl to blunt these responses. Magnesium sulfate, it potentiates the depolarizing and non-depolarizing muscle relaxant. Initial dose of succinylcholine is not reduced because in one dose, it does not potentiate the effect of succinylcholine. Neuromuscular blockage should be monitored and reversal should be done. Now, these patients may require the intensive care in the intensive care when when there is severe preeclampsia or patient develops eclampsia. Most admission to the intensive care units are postpartum. However, if the delivery is not occurred, the management should be directed at obtaining the safe blood pressure. Keep the patient in the safe limit of blood pressure. The mean arterial pressure should be between 105 to 125. Control any convulsion, protect the airway, and plan for delivery of the fetus. Women who have severe preeclampsia or eclampsia generally come to intensive care unit after the delivery of baby to continue with intravenous treatment with the magnesium sulfate and drugs to lower the blood pressure. If the patient develops kidney failure, fluid in the lungs, she may need to come in the intensive care and before the baby is delivered. The frequent nursing observation, medical observation is required to ensure that the blood pressure is controlled and the risk to the seizures is reduced. A bedside monitor should always be there, and always closely monitor the blood pressure and put a urinary catheter to measure the urine output. The urine output and blood pressure are two major parameters which should be monitored very closely. The mother's blood and urine are tested frequently to check the liver and kidney function, check for platelet counts, and for red cell destruction, that is hemolysis. The patient is mostly discharged from the intensive care to the postnatal ward when she does not require magnesium infusion. That is 1 to 2 days after delivery, and when the blood pressure is within the normal limits and is controlled with the oral tablets. Now comes to the next part, the eclampsia. It's a very important entity in our country, in the developing country. The incidence is very high, and it is, as you know, that it is defined as the convulsions and or coma, which is not caused by the coincidental neurological disease. It occurs during pregnancy or puerperium in the woman who has already the preeclampsia criteria. The most seizure, they come in the intrapartum, though the seizure may appear in the first 48 hours post delivery. Late eclampsia is said when the patient develops seizures in the first 48 hours of delivery or 4 weeks of postpartum. Now the risk factors are all the same: patient of young age, nulliparity, multiple gestation, molar pregnancy or patient already having hypertension, they are more at risk of developing eclampsia. The complications, they are very grave complications like pulmonary aspiration. Patient may have edema, patient may have cerebrovascular accident. There is a risk of venous thromboembolism. In the fetus also, there is more chances of growth retardation, prematurity, and placental abruption. Patient in these type of patient, they most of the 80% of the patient, they have the premonitory neurologic symptoms like headache, visual disturbances, photophobia. They have the epigastric or quadrant pain, which is of grave ominous sign, and hyperreflexia. The seizures, they start as a facial twitching and they rapidly progress to a complete tonic-clonic seizure. The mechanism of these seizures is that there is loss of normal cerebral autoregulation, and which results in the internal or vasogenic cerebral edema, interstitial or vasogenic cerebral edema, and there is decreased cerebral blood flow. Coming on to the management is already we have discussed in the preeclampsia part. Now the management focused for eclampsia patients. In the obstetric management, one has to take measures to stop convulsions, establish the airway, and prevent the complications like hypoxemia and aspiration. In the pre-anesthetic assessment, always when you see the patient, assess whether the seizures are controlled or not, whether the patient's fluid balance is maintained or not, blood pressure is under control or not, and continuously monitor pulse oximetry and fetal heart rate. Send the lab investigations as you have sent for the preeclampsia patient. Now, these seizures are usually short-lived and the anesthetic plan is tailor-made. That is, you have to choose and assess the patient. Patient, you have to choose it and proceed accordingly. Use IV induction with propofol or thiopentol. These drugs are very good because they reduce the cerebral metabolic rate, cerebral blood flow, cerebral blood volume, and intracranial pressure. You can consider hyperventilating the patient, but be very, very cautious with it and avoid aggressive and sudden fall in blood pressure, because the cerebral perfusion pressure, if you decrease the mean arterial pressure but the intracranial pressure is same, the cerebral perfusion becomes decreased. Always avoid hypoxia, avoid hyperthermia and hyperglycemia because they cause the neuronal injury. For seizure prophylaxis or seizures, you can give diazepam also in the 5 to 10 milligram increment until the effect comes. Later on, infusion can be started for prophylaxis. It causes excessive sedation and marked respiratory depression may occur. Sorry. Now comes the take-home message. What is the take-home message? First is that it is a serious multi-system disorder and it continues to defy our complete understanding. It is characterized by global endothelial cell dysfunction. The cause is unknown, and you know that there is no effective prophylaxis. We use obstetricians use low dose aspirin, but that is also not so effective. Delivery is the only effective cure. Magnesium sulfate is now proven to be the best medication to prevent and treat eclampsia. Epidural analgesia is considered for labor pain management and regional anesthesia for cesarean section, and it has a very beneficial effects and is preferred. General epidural analgesia for labor pain and cesarean section, and if there is a risk of coagulopathy, there is a risk of epidural hematoma, we can consider the spinal anesthesia also. General anesthesia is needed in the dire emergency for rapid delivery cases or overt coagulation problem, or if there is a risk of maternal hemorrhage and acute fetal distress is there, then there is a need of general anesthesia. So as an anesthesiologist, you should ensure the optimal management of renal function, intravascular volume, airway, and accelerated pressure response before giving the general anesthesia. Thank you.